Storytellers are the original scientists. And, story is all about saying to a human audience, this is why this matters, this is where it came from, and this is where it's going. But no data can ever give you that. No data can ever give you that.
Do our brains just think analytically, like in ones and zeros, or do our brains actually think in story, in narrative? Well, luckily, the guy you just heard from is a story scientist. He's a dual expert in literature and neuroscience. His name is Angus Fletcher. He's a PhD and professor at Ohio State University's Project Narrative. It's listed here as the world's foremost think tank studying how stories work. Pretty decent. And he's also the acclaimed author of several books, including a new one that's coming out this August. It's perfect timing. That one's called Primal Intelligence. You are smarter than you know. Please lean in. This is the Storytelling University. I remember the car rides from Medina to Cleveland on the east side with my grandfather, and I'm like, who is this magician? He would tell me stories, just me and him in a car, and all of a sudden I'm in this freaking world. And I'm like, I want to do that. How does he do that?
Yeah, so the big myth is that stories for communicating. That's the big myth. That's the big myth that we're taught in school. Whereas the reality is that story is for thinking. And I was lucky to discover this when I was working as a young neurophysiologist. And I was specifically studying how one neuron communicates with another neuron. And at that period, neuroscience was dominated by something now known as cognitive science, which basically views the brain as a kind of computer. And so everyone was thinking about the brain as this giant data processing, sense-making machine. And I realized that was totally wrong. Humans, we don't think in data. I mean, you can talk to any human you want. If you give them a whole bunch of data, numbers, statistics, they immediately get confused. You tell them a story, they can lock on for hours. What's happening there? Well, the reason for that is that neurons, which are the building blocks of brains, think in action. And what I started to realize is that the purpose of the brain is to create actions. That's what allowed brains to survive. And you can trace this back to the archaic neurons 500 million years ago. So the fact that people in your family are good at telling stories is the result of 500 million years of evolution, in which the primary selection process for intelligence, the thing that made you a smart person, was your ability to invent a new story. Why? Because a new story is a new plot, and a new plot is a new plan. And a new plan is a new way to exploit your environment, to invent something, to outwit a predator, whatever. So at its root, human intelligence is story. That's why stories are effective at communicating. But more foundationally, if you can teach people to think effectively in story, you can teach them to fix all the problems in their own lives.
So through the evolutionary process, now all of a sudden, we're able to invent these narrative structures to use as tools. Does that resonate? And am I on at least somewhat of the right track there?
Let's go back 500 million years ago.
Yeah.
We're in something known as the Cambrian explosion. This is this huge explosion for the first time where life is taking over the planet. What happens when all these living things are taking over the planet is suddenly for the first time there's competition. Because prior to this point, life had just been kind of bobbing around, and when it ran into food, it would just eat the food. But now all of a sudden, there's more and more life, so you've got to figure out actively how to get to the food. So there evolve in this period, 500 million years ago, two concerns. The first concern is eat. I've got to figure out how to eat. I can't just bob around. I've got to be able to identify food and go towards it. And then the second concern is don't get eaten. Because if all those things are floating around and learning how to eat, one of the things that they're looking to eat is you. So the neuron evolves to solve these two problems of how to eat and how not to get eaten. And in terms of how to eat, what it evolves is essentially what we now think of as computation. It evolves vision, it evolves induction, deduction, symbolic logic, all of these things that computers run. But to not get eaten, it had to be able to come up with new actions that broke logic. Actions that could not be anticipated by the computer brain of all the things that were trying to eat us. And over time, its ability to invent a single action became the ability to invent multiple actions that it could chain together. Once you start chaining together multiple new actions, what do you have? You have a narrative, you have a plot, you have a story. And so this is something that's actually deep in the part of our brain that we call the motor cortex, the part that invents actions. If you ever watch an athlete, they'll be able to move their body, or a dancer, they'll be able to move their body spontaneously in ways that are not necessarily thinking about consciously. If you look at a surgeon or someone who's very skilled with their fingers, these are stories that are running from their brain to their fingers that are telling them beginning, middle, end, right? Here's the sequence of events you've got to run. What happens over time in terms of storytelling is really probably in the last million years or so, after the development of speech and language, we start to say, hey, I can take a plan from my head and give it to you. So I can start sharing my plans, and I can start sharing my personal history and my story of myself, but also we can make plans together. And then where literature and the kind of work that you do comes in is we start to tell what I would call kind of, special stories or super stories. These are stories which help other brains make stories. So when you were listening in the car to your grandfather,
Yeah.
he was telling stories that were sparking your imagination.
Yes.
The purpose of those stories wasn't to say, hey, here's a great way for you to build a house or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Careful of the saber-tooth tiger in the woods.
Right. It wasn't that kind of a story, right?
Okay.
It was instead, by listening to this story, Aaron, I'm making you a better storyteller. This is the story of stories. And so over time, we developed those, and those stories of stories and those storytellers became individuals in our society who we held up and we celebrated because they were able to stimulate the imagination of everybody else. And so if you go look, for example, if you think of Einstein, he's considered to be someone who revolutionized modern science. What was he doing? He was reading Shakespeare. Van Gogh revolutionizes modern art. What was Van Gogh doing? He was reading Shakespeare. If you look at Nikola Tesla revolutionized modern technology. What was he doing? He was reading Shakespeare. Yeah. So Shakespeare's a great example of how a storyteller sparks the imaginations of all these other individuals and allows them to be creative in all their other domains.
The experience also, we'll use the car as a metaphor, that was happening. He changed time and space, Angus. He's telling me a story about how he beat up the Golden Glove champion of Youngstown. And it was hilarious because he beat him because the guy that he picked a fight with ended up losing because he broke his hand on my grandfather's head. So there's this plot, right? And then all of a sudden there's a punchline, there's humor, but I can see him at that dance. I can see him trying to vie over the same sweetheart that they both are trying to vie over, right? Like he tells this incredible thing, but I feel close to him. I feel like I know him. There's an emotional resonance there. I feel that there's this sort of experience that goes outside of myself that I touch. What is happening there from a story scientist perspective?
A lot of things are happening. So there are three separate...
Help unpack me. I'll send you a copay, okay?
All right. There are three separate big things that we can talk about, and then there's more, but let's just talk about the three big things. The first thing is the relationship of emotion to narrative. The second is why you connected to your grandfather. And the third was why was there this sense of being part of something bigger. So let's just kind of walk through those. So in terms of the relationship between emotion and narrative, this is obviously very well known. If you go to a Hollywood movie, if you read a story that affects you, you immediately feel these strong emotions. Where's that coming from? Well, what we think, because we're mistaught in school, is that stories exist to create emotion. Actually, the reason that emotions exist in the brain is to help us diagnose our own story. And so if you reflect back on your own life story, you will start to feel certain things. You might feel joy, you might feel grief, what have you. That's actually telling you about the condition of your own life story. So very simply, your brain does best when your life story has an integrated past and a branching future. When you feel things like grief and shame, that's telling you that your past is not integrated, that your multiple selves are living in multiple worlds. When you start to feel emotions like anger, that's telling you that your future isn't branching. It's telling you that your future is narrowing. And so your emotions existed to help you analyze your own life narrative. The second thing is we were talking about why was you identified with your grandfather?
Yeah, like there in the ballroom, yeah. I just felt sort of a closeness to him.
Yeah. So we think that did not exist until about the year 1600.
Holy shit!
Yeah. Now we could be wrong about that, but there's a reason that we think about that is because it doesn't show up in literature until that moment. So it's possibly in oral storytelling before that. But to give you the simple overview of it, prior to Shakespeare, there were monologues and there were dialogues. A monologue is one character gets up on stage and he tells you how he feels. A dialogue is two characters having an argument, right?
Yes.
What is a soliloquy? A soliloquy is a character having a conversation with themselves. So it's a monologic dialogue.
That's right.
So what happens in that is that character expresses a conflict within themselves.
To be or not to be. That's the
yes.
Okay.
That's the exact one. That's a classic example of it.
Yeah.
So we get involved in that conflict, and then we import that conflict into our own brain and start thinking, how would I wrestle with it? And then we get transported into the story. So it's that process of identifying with the character's conflict that puts us emotionally in, and we start thinking, what would I do in their situation? As opposed to earlier stories are much more about kind of judging characters from outside or evaluating their behaviors from outside. We are cued into this by a very weird thing that happened after Shakespeare. A playwright called Corneille, he wrote a play called The Cid. So, yeah, and in The Cid, there's a character who goes back and forth between love and honor. He's like, should I, love, honor, same thing, same soliloquy. After the first night's performance, people came back on the next night and started interrupting the play and trying to climb on the stage to be the character. And that was when they shut the plays down and they're like, something weird is happening here. And
something's happening here.
Something's happening here, right? And so that invention, and so, that may have existed in oral literature before, we don't know, but whatever it was that's happening there, letting the other person into the mental process of not being certain. And that allows you to feel like you're in the moment as the mind is wrestling with a problem. And you'll see that that's why, the engine of story is conflict, right? Yes. External conflict is typical of older literature. Internal conflict is typical of newer literature. Internal conflict is the basis of soliloquy, is the basis of identification. So that's the science behind that. Final question you asked is, why do you feel part of something bigger? Well, it's because, as humans, because we have story-thinking minds, ultimately, we want a sense of direction and purpose. Mm-hmm. We want to know, what's my bigger narrative?
Yes.
And when we find someone else, and we connect with them, we're in the same narrative, all of a sudden we realize this is a bigger story, this is a bigger narrative. And that's how we as humans build community, is by finding those narratives that are bigger than any of us individually. Because those are narratives, because they live beyond us, we feel that they live beyond death. So they're the closest we get to immortality, and that's why they're so imbued with a sense of purpose and joy and ecstasy in the higher things.
I sense it and feel it, and have been kind of a practitioner in a way, going back to the old school, the oral tradition. That's why I have such a reverence for the oral tradition, where it feels like I'm connecting with something that's gone way back. I might have a microphone, but at the same time, it's just something, putting it out into the ether. And it actually precedes writing, right?
Oral storytelling is where we co-create narratives with an audience. It's also, to your point, something that can live through time. So here's an interesting story. I was talking to a couple scientists recently about something known as aquaterra, which I'd never heard of before.
I haven't either.
I said, what's aquaterra? They said, well, you've heard of like Plato's Atlantis and stuff like that, the idea. I was like, yeah. They're like, well, that's baloney. There's no Plato's Atlantis. But there is this thing known as aquaterra, which are these regions of the world that were submerged, that are now submerged, but were up and humans were living on them 100,000 years ago. So Doggerland in the north of England is one of them. I said, that's totally fascinating. And they said, yeah, when you think that's fascinating, here's an interesting twist on that story. If you go down and talk to the Aboriginal people of Australia, they have these dream stories, these dream song stories, where they tell these stories to each other. And these stories work as maps of the land. They're plans for walking. And they will tell these stories, and recently, it was noticed by archaeologists that these people telling these stories would walk to the edge of the ocean and stop. And the scientists would say, well, that's obviously like a broken story, or there's something wrong with that. When they traced the story forward and they found aquaterra, they found that actually in these stories was a memory of a land that was 100,000 years old, that was being kept alive in these stories and been passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. And that's just an example of the kind of wisdom that is buried in these stories that we in the modern world are blind to. Mm-hmm. But if you spend time with a storyteller, you can recover.
The difference between narrative intelligence and analytical intelligence. Can you help unpack those two modes as you've described in your work?
Yeah, so what you're calling analytic, I would call logic, which is a very well-formalized system. It's what computers use. So if you look inside a computer, you'll see it's running something called an ALU, an arithmetic logic units.
Okay.
And that runs three very simple operations, and or not. So that's all that's happening inside a computer, is those three operations. Those operations run equations. So equations are math. Right. 1 + 1 = 2. If you have an equation, all the things in the equation have to exist at the same time. The things on the left side of the equation have to exist at the same time as the right side of the equation, right?
Yeah.
That means that equations cannot process stories. Why? Because stories have actions, and actions are made out of causes and effects. And a cause and its effect cannot occur at the same time. So logic, analysis, data, all that can handle is math.
That's right.
Stories handle why things happen. Where did they come from? Well, making sense is a logic term. So I would actually say giving purpose and direction. This is an example of the invasion of logical terms into narrative. Yeah, so people always talk about, we have to make, stories help us make sense of our lives and stuff like that. No. Stories give direction to our lives. And also, beyond giving direction, stories also create openness. Because the thing is we only know what's in the present. So let me explain the way this story works in the brain very quickly.
Yes.
We're taught as communicators that stories run beginning, middle, end. That's what we're taught, beginning, middle, end. Story in the brain actually works middle, beginning, end. Why is that? Well, because we live in the present tense. And when you live in the present tense, something surprising happens. And then you say to yourself, wow, where did that come from? And so your brain guesses the beginning of the story. And then after it guesses the beginning of the story, it imagines what is the future of the story. So it's always going middle, beginning, end. Middle, beginning, end. And what that means is that story is the place of imagination, possibility, speculation, hypothesis, science, all of these things which are different from math, data, business analysis. And so storytellers are the original scientists. And, story is all about saying to a human audience, this is why this matters, this is where it came from, and this is where it's going. But no data can ever give you that. No data can ever give you that.
When I create a story, you just kind of mirrored exactly sort of the process, which is, one, there's something in the moment that inspires an idea. So it's like, okay, there's the idea. Two, what I then say is, well, how did I start? So like, how am I going to start the story? So like, how do I get you to the middle? And then I actually envision the ending, whether it is an open, closed, or whatever, right? There are people who are naturally predisposed to this, or is it something that's inherent that one can unlock?
Everybody can tell stories. In fact, everybody is excellent at telling stories. This is the definition of human intelligence.
Y'all hear that?
Thinker. Yeah. So first you've got to start by saying, what is something that's interesting? And that comes from vulnerability and surprise. So we've got to start by finding something interesting about you. Then we've got to be honest about where did that come from? And that freaks out a lot of people because a lot of people don't like to be honest and candid. The best storytellers are always candid, right? You've been very vulnerable talking with me right now. You've revealed all sorts of your process as we've been talking. So you have to work a lot of times, if you're going to be an effective storyteller, at being candid. Then the final thing is if you're good at spotting things that are surprising and you're good at being candid, a lot of people struggle with figuring out where it's going. And so most storytellers that I work with, that's the muscle that gets stronger and stronger over their career. They get better and better and faster at realizing this is where I'm going. And they can hold on to it even through like a 30-minute digression, They can go all over the place,
Right.
This is how Homer in the Odyssey works, It's basically the entire thing is a giant digression, But he knows how to do it because he's so... And so that's the final ultimate muscle that storytellers develop. And that's what allows for not just 7-minute stories, but 70-minute stories and 700-minute stories.
It confirms something in a known sense, that what I've been doing isn't just something that is made up, the feeling that I get from it. That it's not just me, because, sometimes I get God, is this just me being like, this is really important, I'm telling people it's important, but I don't have the data to say why. But it fucking is. Excuse my language, but it's so damn important.
It's the most important thing. So the upcoming book that I have and the recent work that I've been doing is with U.S. Army Special Operations.
Yes,
and so
incredible.
We're working with these elite units, and their job is to go out there and solve these essentially impossible problems under life and death situations. And how are they thinking? They're thinking in story. They're trying to make a plan. They're trying to make a plan faster than the adversary. And the same thing is happening now in our world. We're watching AI. We're watching all these problems encroach around us, and people are freezing. Why? Because they can't come up with a plan. They don't have the imagination to come up with a better story for the future. They don't have the kind of narrative skills that your stories develop. Mm-hmm. And so this is why I think it's so critical that we train people in these story skills, but we also create and encourage and nurture people like yourself who can develop those skills. Because, you don't become a better storyteller by sitting in class. Right. If I get up in the front room and diagram a story, that's not making you a better storyteller. What's making you a better storyteller is listening to a great story and then trying to create your own version of it in a supportive environment where that storyteller is like, yeah, try this, try that. And then you kind of learn by doing. Really, the truth of the matter is we need to make more people who can think in story to come up with the plans and the plots that can solve all of the problems that are confronting us, because AI is not going to solve those problems. We're going to have to solve them ourselves.
No, it sounds like it's actually a big part of our survival. A big part of how we, right? Like, it's the thing, right?
It is the reason for our survival.
The play is the thing.
Yes, right. The play is the thing to catch the conscience. But it is the thing. It is actually, because every one of us is here because one of our ancestors made a plan for dealing with a hard situation. That plan was a story. That plan was a plot. That plan was a narrative. Planning is the source of all these things. The reason that our ancestors, even when they were struggling against nature, even when they were hungry, the reason that they created theater, the reason that they had time for stories, the reason that in ancient Athens they paid for everyone to go see these plays, even in times of war, was because they realized that nothing was more important than the imagination. The imagination is what creates new planets. Where does imagination come from? Imagination comes from new stories, not formulaic stories, but stories that contain characters who are different from you, who act in unexpected ways, who twist the plot, who weave and bob, not the kinds of things that are mass produced nowadays by Hollywood, which are basically a form of anesthesia, but actual stories that generate wonder and surprise. And those come in oral storytelling, to your earlier point, because as an oral storyteller, you can tell when your audience is getting a little bit bored, and then you can intervene, you know? And you can tell when they're getting lost, and you can come back and you can help them. And so it's always this process of always actively developing their imagination. So it is absolutely critical, and we are going to need that now because we are losing our capacities of imagination because we are spending too much time on technology and we have too much faith in data. Data perfectly predicts yesterday. Story creates the future.
Are there things we're doing as human storytellers that AI isn't and can't ever do?
Yes, everything. So, I mean, I have tons of peer-reviewed research on this. Let's say a couple things up front.
Sure.
AI is not the same as an LLM. What people now call AI, there are these LLMs or these chatbots.
And that is just for the audience, is that language learning models, correct?
Language learning models, yeah, like Claude and Anthropic and Grok and all these things. These things are incapable of narrative. They can only understand language. They cannot create new stories. I can go through the technicalities of this for years and years and years and years and years and years, but it's a fact. They cannot create new stories. So these things are incapable of doing the basic thing that we humans can do, which is come up with new planets. All they can do is regurgitate old and existing knowledge and language. Now, they can be parasitic. They can plagiarize things, If you're a quote-unquote knowledge worker, which is what a lot of white-collar people are, who thinks it's your day job to sit on the internet and just pull together web pages, AI can do that, right? Yeah. And so you're going to be out of work. But if your job is actually someone who creates new things, who's an artist, who's an engineer, who's a scientist, who's an imaginer, AI is never going to get anywhere near that. What AI does, even real AI, which is to say not LLMs, but machine learning processes, is it automates existing systems. So it's good for like library functions and logistics and things like that. It is incapable and is in fact antithetical to innovation. It doesn't
because
innovate.
It's not sentient in that way, right? It's not.
No, like it's got nothing to do with sentience. You can be insentient. Your insentient brain can create things, right? It's got to do with the mechanics of it. So what these things do is they see patterns. So they're seeing patterns. What narrative does is it sees exceptions. And so it's a completely different mechanism of thought. It's like the difference between a fork and a spoon. Or a hammer and a saw. AI has functions. It's a tool. It's not bad. Like everything has a function. But that function isn't everything. And we need to understand the tool, respect this tool, understand what its functions are, and then respect our humanity and cultivate these storytelling abilities and others. So as far as job seeking goes, I know it's a terrifying time. And I know what you're seeing if you spend too much time on LinkedIn and these servers is like, you've got to like basically fit what they're looking for. And there's this whole process of becoming homogenous and being undistinctive and not sticking out and hewing to the formula and, these hacks and so on and so forth. That's the path to the computer. That's the path to AI.
That's right.
Actually, the way to success is being unique, doubling down on what's special about you. So you, Aaron, you've discovered a completely new career that no one else ever had before you. And I can almost guarantee that everyone who's successful in this world has invented their own career in some way, or they've invented the foundation of that career. That's what I would say to job seekers is get out of the dependency cycle of trying to please somebody else and give them the formula that they're looking for. Look at what's unique about yourself. Figure out how to develop that into something of value.
Do you have a few stories, movies, moments when you were growing up that was like, oh shit, like the car ride that I had with my grandfather? Do you have a few of those or one of those?
I do. Let me give you two quick ones. So when I was a really little kid, I was obsessed with these French comics called Asterix and Obelix. And there are these totally bizarre stories about this tiny group of rebellious people who are standing up to the entire Roman Empire. But they are just set pieces in extraordinary storytelling. And if everyone wants to read just like a brilliant example of a story, go read Asterix and Obelix and the Chieftain's Shield. It's a story that just seems like completely rambling, idiosyncratic, odd. And then the further and further you get into it, the more that it cinches and cinches and cinches. And then you get to the last page, you realize that everything you've learned over the entire story has led up to that one moment. And it's a children's book. So it's so simple that a child can understand it. It takes place in, like 40 or 50 pages and a cartoon, right? It's a comic and incredible. The other story that really affected me when I was about 13 or 14 is Malcolm X's autobiography. And two things that I love about that are, first of all, it's so candid. It's so honest. And I really want to say to people, The best stories are not formulaic, they're true, they're honest, they're candid. Mine your experience for things that are unique and surprising and maybe that you're afraid to confess. Like, that's the real power. So I love true stories. And the other thing that I love about Malcolm X is he changed. He changed. He didn't just change once, he changed twice. And that tells all of us that our stories can transform. We can change. That's the real power of story inside us, is to become a new person who carries the old character with them, with wisdom, but opens up these new possibilities for our future.